Welcome back. In this mini lecture, I really want to emphasize the importance of the Magna Carta. A lot of political science classes and a lot of American government classes emphasize the Magna Carta as really the first democratic document in the English language, and I just don't think that that's true. The Magna Carta does not say anything about liberty or democracy. The Magna Carta is important, and the major theme or takeaway that I want you to take out of this mini lecture is that the Magna Carta is important because it ushers in this concept of constitutionalism. And at its core, and I'll end the mini lecture by repeating this point. The essence of constitutionalism is the restraint of political power. We see for centuries absolute monarchs on the continent of Europe claiming divine right. And in Britain, very, very early on, we see a power sharing tradition that is formalized with the Magna Carta. So I'll read along with your notes and then I will make some comments. I would designate the beginning of British democratic evolution as 1215 when King John was compelled to sign the Magna Carta, which explicitly protected feudal customs, rights, and limited the power of the monarch by recognizing power sharing and the primacy of the rule of law. Now, this concept of power sharing had been informal. I mentioned it earlier in the last mini lecture, I believe, this notion that kings consulted with their nobles. This went all the way back to the 5th century, so some 700 years before the Magna Carta. But in this particular case, the restraint of political power meant that the barons, the churchmen, the landed aristocrats, as I would call them, had certain rights which the king could not encroach upon. One example of this would be a jury trial by one's peers. There were also certain property rights, for example. So it is an important document in the notion that in the United States, for example, we make the assumption that constitutionalism and democracy go together. But I pointed out in the first set of lectures that that's not always true. You can have a written constitution, a really elaborate and detailed one, for example, the 1936 Stalinist Constitution that was drafted in the Soviet Union was far longer, far more detailed than the American Constitution, but that Constitution did not contain constitutionalism. It did not restrain the political power of Joseph Stalin. Now, to me, even though Roskin talks about how King John signed this document and that that's remarkable, and it clearly is. But to me, what's even more remarkable is that not only did King John sign this document and honor its provisions, but British kings for the next 4 centuries did. In other words, for 400 years until the Stuarts, and we'll get into them in a couple of mini lectures from now, but until the 1600s, it was just accepted that there were restraints on the power of British monarchs. So you should know that the Magna Carta was feudal and reactionary. You should know that at its core, it limited the king's power, making sure that he stayed within the law. As I mentioned earlier, the Magna Carta formalized a centuries-old informal tradition that the king was in a balance with the nobles. And in this particular case, notice that we see a goal, I believe, in Britain for centuries that certainly is at the heart of our constitutional convention. You want to prevent despotism, that is tyranny, right? A king that is too strong, that is absolute in his power, is likely to abuse it, right? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, according to Lord Acton. So there's no question that tyranny is a political evil, but so too is anarchy. That if political society breaks down, if you don't have executive power at all, you could teeter on anarchy. And certainly for a while, this is what happened in the 17th century. There was a power vacuum, even for about a decade or so. The only organized political force in Britain was Cromwell and the army. And so you have a very brief period of what I would consider military dictatorship. That's very rare in Britain. The norm is to have both a monarch and a parliament, and I'll talk about both of these, both in the historical section in terms of where they emerged and how they act in political practice today. So the Magna Carta legitimized the power of an independent aristocracy, which was a check and a balance on the power of the king. And you notice that I'm using terminology that for those of you who took American government, and it's probably most of you, you have heard before. So the Magna Carta, bat down to the letters. The Magna Carta legitimized the power of an independent aristocracy, and what you're going to see over the centuries is, for a lot of reasons, the aristocrats very slowly become stronger. The monarch gradually becomes weaker. For a bit, the two are relatively co-equal, and then the parliament eclipses the power of the crown to where today the crown only has informal powers, no real formal powers, and it is the Parliament in the House of Commons that governs the country. The Magna Carta symbolized limits on the power of the king and formalized the recognition of the supremacy of the law. The nobility and the church both became checks on the power of the monarch, and you will notice that later on, when we get into a political struggle, Henry VIII, you've heard of him, the man who had a problem with the ladies in his life. You will, if you've already read this chapter or if you know the story, Henry VIII wanted a divorce. The Catholic Church would not grant it. Henry VIII goes to the Parliament to secularize England, to rid England of the Catholic Church, to create a new church, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, which had an influence on my family. One of the Randalls becomes the Anglican Bishop of Bath in southern England. So certainly this struggle has some influence on my family. But the things that you really need to know for exam purposes, you should know the date of the Magna Carta, 1215. That may or may not be on the exam. It's kind of a trivial pursuit question. I'm not sure I would ask that. But for sure, one of the questions I will embed in the notes is the idea that the Magna Carta is a feudal document, it's a reactionary document, and the significance of this document, the thing that is most important, is that it brings in constitutionalism in a formal sense to Britain. So constitutionalism comes to Britain 650 years before mass-based democracy does. So they're not the same thing. The Magna Carta is not a modern democratic document, but it is a constitutional document and very, very significant. If you keep following down the notes, the aristocrats began the parliament. As you can see by the date, it was only a half a century after the Magna Carta was signed that the first parliament was convened. Kings in England, remember the Normans were French speakers. I told you that earlier. And as such, the English kings still had land holdings in what we would call France. Some of you may remember this from world history. I had a very memorable classroom teacher. I told you about him earlier, the guy who was obsessed with bloodshed and violence. So he's the one, for example, that I heard the Magna Carta was a feudal document, that it's a constitutional document. I stole that concept from my old junior high teacher, who today would probably go to jail because of the way he taught. But he is the only teacher of mine, K to 12, that I still remember sections of his lectures. So he was weird, but he was a great teacher. Now, I wrote something that, I'm always trying to convince my political science students that this stuff is about our lives. And let me give you an example. So your notes say by the late 13th century, English kings saw the utility of calling 2 to 4 knights from each shire, right? So if you watch Lord of the Rings, right, you're familiar with the shire. But the shire was a political designation that was roughly a county. And the chief law enforcement official of the shire was a reef. So get it? Shire reef, sheriff. So today in our counties, the chief law enforcement official in counties is the sheriff. And so we stole that notion of our chief law enforcement official from the early English days, from, as you can see, the late 13th century. This sheriff concept has been around for a long, long time. And a number of burghers, these would be merchants from the cities, to consult with the king. Now, as I mentioned, these English kings claimed lands on the continent, and once again, you may remember the battle for Gascony, which is kind of in the south western part of France. It borders the Atlantic Ocean, but it's towards the southern end of it. And of course, there were battles with the native French king, and who was going to control these, particularly when people died. You had these battles for what we call succession. And so the King of England needed to finance these wars, the most famous of which would be the 100 Years' Wars, which lasted on and off for about 114 years, from 1338 to, I believe, 1452. And so the aristocrats gathered together and said, okay, we'll give you your revenue, your money. We'll provide manpower, our best knights to go fight these wars. But in return, we want things. We want title. We want you to give us land. And most importantly, we want you to acknowledge that we have a say and some political power. So it's intriguing, as your notes point out, that Parliament, which governs Britain today, began as an extension of the King's Court. The king believed that he was using Parliament. He was using these aristocrats merely as a forum to raise revenue for the crown. And certainly that's kind of the way it looked for a little while, but it did not take long for the Parliament to become more independent. Now, it took a long time for them to eventually become supreme over the crown. As your notes point out, it took some 400 years for Parliament to become supreme after what we call the Glorious Revolution, which I will get into later on. To conclude this mini lecture, and I'll finish up some of this in the next lecture before I move on to the next topic. The knights and the burghers, the merchants, formed the lower house, which eventually became the House of Commons. The House of Commons did not become the dominant institution for a few hundred years. Don't let the name mislead you. The commons was not representative. It only represented the powerful and the wealthy. And I'll pick up this point in the next mini lecture.